Hello, history lovers, and welcome back. Tonight, we're not just opening a book, we're prying open a rusty, splintered door to a world you think you know. We're venturing into the so-called Dark Ages, a time of soaring cathedrals, whispered prayers, and the faint, ever-present smell of despair. Forget the shimmering armor and the fairy tale romances. The real Middle Ages were less about chivalry and more about trying not to get dysentery from a bad piece of bread. The truth is, the past is a foreign country, and their customs were challenging. Before we shatter any more illusions, here's one truth that's crystal clear: discovering stories like this is what our channel is all about. If you agree, and you want to support this journey through the ages, giving that like button a quick tap is a secret handshake that tells us we're on the right track. It truly helps more than you know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. What if I told you that the single most dangerous thing you'll do all day is wake up? Congratulations. The year is 1340. The first thing you register isn't the gentle morning light, but a faint, insistent itching. It's a familiar sensation, the tiny footfalls of your resident flea population, who treat your bed not as a temporary shelter, but as their ancestral homeland. They are a constant, a given, as much a part of your life as breathing. Your bed, by the way, is a burlap sack stuffed with straw, moss, and last year's regrets. The straw is often damp and slowly composting beneath you, generating a faint warmth that is less comforting and more biologically alarming. It rests on the dirt floor, which doubles as drainage for when the thatched roof inevitably gives up fighting the rain. There is no concept of a thread count, only a bug count, and yours is thriving. Your pillow is a log you stole from the woods, its bark worn smooth by years of use, and your blanket is a coarse wool cloak that smells faintly of wet dog and wood smoke, weighing you down like a physical manifestation of your social status. Suddenly, a loud, metallic clang shatters the pre-dawn quiet. That's the Angelus bell from the local church, the medieval equivalent of a smartphone alarm, only it can't be snoozed and it comes with a healthy dose of spiritual obligation. You groan and sit up, your joints popping and cracking like a bundle of dry twigs. You're 25 years old, which, thanks to a lifetime of manual labor and poor nutrition, has put you firmly in middle age. Your back has a permanent, weary curve, a souvenir from 1,000 days spent bent over in a field, a condition so common it doesn't even have a name. It's just the shape of a peasant. Your home is a one-room wattle and daub hut. Think of it as a primitive, tiny home, but instead of clever storage solutions, you have your entire family, a few chickens who wandered in, and a goat who pays rent in existential dread. The smoke from the central hearth, which has no chimney, stings your eyes and coats every surface with a layer of greasy soot. This constant smoke exposure will eventually lead to chronic lung problems, but that's a problem for future you, a future you're not entirely sure will arrive. Privacy isn't a word you know. It's a concept as alien as a weekend. The notion of a separate childhood is also a luxury. Your 5-year-old is not seen as a developing child, but as a small, inefficient adult who will soon be expected to contribute. Welcome to your morning. And trust me, this is the easy part. You've successfully disentangled yourself from your sleeping family. Now, a primal urge calls. And it's not subtle. This is where your appreciation for modern plumbing will skyrocket. In the 14th century, the bathroom isn't a room, it's a series of unfortunate choices. If you're a peasant, your finest facility is a wooden bucket in the corner or, for the slightly more sophisticated, a small outhouse with a trench, often shared between several families. The contents of that bucket? They get tossed into the street. If you're considerate, you'll yell, "Gardes l'eau." French for, "watch the water," before you dump it. This is the origin of the English phrase, garde l'eau, a courtesy that rarely saved anyone from a foul surprise. The streets of a medieval town were, in essence, open sewers. A flowing testament to everyone else's morning routine, a communal, biological slushy of human and animal waste, rotting vegetables, and offal from the local butcher. In cities like London, the Thames River was both the primary source of drinking water and the city's largest sewer. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The real professionals in this field were the gong farmers, or night soil men. Their job was to empty the town's latrines and cesspits under the cover of darkness. It was one of the most reviled jobs, but also one of the best paid, because nobody else wanted to wade through the collective filth of 1,000 people for a living. They were legally required to live in specific areas and could only work at night, a testament to how foul their trade was considered. But surely it's better in a castle, right? Well, you might have a garderobe. This was essentially a stone toilet seat built into the castle wall, with a chute that dropped everything straight down into the moat below. A brilliant defensive feature, until your enemies realized the moat now smelled like a public health crisis and, more importantly, that the toilet chute was a potential, albeit disgusting, entry point. During sieges, particularly brave, or desperate, attackers were known to attempt to climb up these chutes. As for hygiene, forget it. The Romans had their tersorium, a sea sponge on a stick, which was passed around a communal latrine. You, a medieval peasant, are not so lucky. You make do with a handful of hay, a clump of moss, or some broad leaves. This might explain why shaking hands wasn't a universal greeting. So, after navigating this minefield of muck, you haven't even had a bite to eat yet. Let's fix that, shall we? You survived the morning ritual. Time for a hearty breakfast to fuel your day of backbreaking labor. I hope you're hungry for disappointment. There is no fresh brewed coffee, no sizzling bacon, no orange juice. Your breakfast is a bowl of pottage. This isn't so much a recipe as it is a science experiment in long-term food storage. It's a thick, savory porridge of oats, barley, peas, and whatever tough vegetables you could pull from the garden, leeks, onions, cabbage. It simmers in a cauldron over the fire, perpetually. New ingredients are added daily, but the pot is rarely ever fully emptied or cleaned. This perpetual stew might have bits in it that have been simmering for weeks. Think of it like the Solera system used for aging sherry, but instead of delicious, complex flavors, you get a murky, beige slurry that tastes vaguely of earth and desperation. Alongside your pottage, you have a slab of bread. This isn't a fluffy sourdough, it's a dense, heavy loaf made from rye and barley flour, known as maslin bread. It's so tough you could use it to hammer a nail. Most peasants didn't have their own ovens, so bread was baked in a communal oven owned by the lord of the manor, for which you had to pay a fee. Wheat bread, fine and white, was a status symbol called manchet, reserved for the lord. Your bread is gritty, sometimes bulked up with ground-up acorns or bean flour in lean times, and it gives your jaw a serious workout. To wash it all down. Ale. Yes, at sunrise. For everyone, including the children. But this isn't the strong stuff. It's small beer, a very low-alcohol brew. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, made it significantly safer to drink than the local stream. Think of it as the medieval kombucha, a fermented, life-sustaining beverage that was more about hydration than intoxication. It was a crucial source of calories in a meager diet. Meat, cheese, and eggs are luxuries, saved for feast days like Easter or Christmas. Spices like pepper or cloves. Those were imported from the east along treacherous trade routes, making them worth more than their weight in gold. A single peppercorn might be used as currency. So you choke down your gritty bread, sip your lukewarm ale, and try to get enough calories to survive until the next joyless meal. You're fed, sort of. Now it's time to get dressed for success, or in this case, for survival. Your wardrobe is a masterclass in minimalism. You own one primary outfit, a long wool tunic, maybe with a linen undertunic or shift, if you're well off. Men might wear linen brays, which are baggy under trousers, and hose for their legs. This single outfit is your work uniform, your formal wear, and your pajamas. It's washed maybe a few times a year, in a process involving hauling water, scrubbing with lye, a caustic substance made from wood ash, and hoping for a sunny day to dry it. Consequently, your clothes are stiff with dirt and sweat. The process of making the cloth itself was monumental. For linen, it began with planting flax, harvesting it, retting it, a rotting process, beating it, spinning the fibers into thread, and finally weaving it on a loom. Wool followed a similar path from sheep to shawl. It was an incredibly labor-intensive process, which is why clothes were so valuable and repaired until they were literally falling apart. Fashion isn't about style, it's about durability. The colors of your clothes are also a dead giveaway of your status. Dull browns and grays from simple vegetable dyes are the norm. A vibrant red, made from the madder root, or a deep blue from the woad plant, would signal significant wealth. Sumptuary laws even dictated what materials and colors different social classes were allowed to wear, ensuring you couldn't dress above your station. Your wardrobe isn't a collection, it's like a starting character's gear in a video game. You get one set, and you're stuck with it for the entire campaign. Naturally, this lack of hygiene means you are never truly alone. You are a walking ecosystem. Lice, fleas, and other tiny companions are a fact of life for everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest king. A constant, low-grade itch is the background music to your entire existence. If you develop a rash, like the dreaded St. Anthony's fire, which was a skin infection, there is no cream, no doctor to diagnose it. You just scratch and pray it doesn't get infected. Now that you're dressed in your finest, filthiest outfit, let's go to work. Time to show the world that winning smile. Except, you probably shouldn't. In the Middle Ages, an open-mouthed smile was often a horror show. Oral hygiene was, to put it mildly, not a priority. There was no Colgate, no Oral-B, no minty fresh floss. Some people might rub their teeth with a cloth and a mixture of salt and sage, or chew on a birch twig to scrape off the grime, but for most, teeth were simply left to their own devices. And their devices were failing. The medieval diet, full of gritty bread and tough foods, wore down enamel relentlessly. A common belief was that a tooth worm burrowed into your teeth and gnawed away at them, causing the pain. Folk remedies were bizarre. Some suggested inhaling the smoke from burning henbane seeds to make the worms fall out. By the time you reached 30, you likely had multiple missing teeth, rampant cavities, and chronic gum disease. Your breath. Let's just say it could wilt flowers. Halitosis was so universal that it probably wasn't even noticed, blending into the general miasma of medieval life. When a toothache became unbearable, you didn't see a dentist. You went to the barber surgeon. This was the same person who gave you a haircut, and he would pull your tooth with a terrifying-looking iron tool called a dental pelican, with no anesthetic. The risk of a splintered jaw or a fatal infection from the procedure was immense. A simple abscess, something a modern antibiotic could clear up in days, was a potential death sentence. People would pray to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, for relief. But often, the only cure was extraction or endurance. So you learned to live with the throbbing pain, because the cure was often worse than the disease. Your teeth ache, your body itches, and your stomach is rumbling. It's time for work. There's no commute, no office, and no such thing as work-life balance. For the 90% of the population who were peasants, your job was a sunrise-to-sunset subscription service where your life was the monthly fee. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. It belonged to a lord, and you owed him a share of your crops and, more importantly, your labor. This was called boon work, days of unpaid service you were required to perform on the lord's personal land, especially during critical times like planting and harvesting. Your tools were rudimentary, a heavy wooden plow, maybe pulled by an ox if the village could afford one, a sickle for harvesting, and your own weary body. The work was dictated by the seasons, plowing in the spring, haymaking in the summer, harvesting in the autumn, and threshing and repairing tools in the winter. There were no weekends, only 6 days of relentless toil and a 7th day for prayer, which was mandatory. If you weren't a farmer, your options weren't much better. You might be an artisan in a town, a member of a guild. Guilds were part trade union, part social club, and part cartel. They set prices, controlled quality, and limited competition. But the work was still grueling. A tanner spent his days curing animal hides in vats of urine and feces. Or perhaps a fuller, whose job it was to clean and thicken wool cloth by stomping on it for hours in a trough of stale urine and clay. These jobs were essential, but they were smelly, dangerous, and physically crushing. Women had the privilege of double duty, working in the fields alongside the men, while also being solely responsible for childcare, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, brewing the family's ale, and tending to the small livestock. Breaks were not a thing. If you got sick or injured, there was no safety net. You worked, or you starved. It was that simple. You've been toiling under the sun, or perhaps in the freezing rain. Let's talk about the weather, which in the Middle Ages was less a matter of small talk and more a matter of life and death. Your home was not a sanctuary, it was a meteorological sieve. This period was the beginning of what scientists call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling period that made winters harsher and growing seasons shorter. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by several years of relentless rain and cold, was a stark example. It led to widespread crop failure, starvation, and even reports of cannibalism across Europe. Winter in your wattle-and-daub hut was brutal. Drafts whistled through the walls. The single open hearth provided a small bubble of warmth, but firewood was precious. The forests belonged to the Lord, and being caught gathering wood could result in a fine or even a mutilation. You slept huddled together for warmth, your breath pluming in the frigid air, and woke with fingers and toes numb from the relentless cold. Summer offered a different kind of misery. With no ventilation, your hut transformed into a stiflingly hot clay oven. The air grew thick and heavy, ripe with the smell of sweat and fermenting food scraps. Swarms of flies were your constant companions, drawn to the filth and the warmth. You'd work all day under a blistering sun with no sunscreen, your wool tunic drenched in sweat, chafing your skin raw. Heatstroke wasn't a medical diagnosis, it was just called a bad turn. Whether you were freezing or boiling, one thing remained constant: you were at the complete mercy of the elements. There was no thermostat to adjust, only prayers to be offered. All this work has made you thirsty. You wander over to the village stream for a refreshing drink. Don't. In the medieval world, water was a beautiful, sparkling liar. Every stream was a potential vector for disease. Upriver, another village was dumping its waste. A dead animal could be decomposing just around the bend. A single gulp could introduce you to a world of bacteria and parasites, leading to dysentery, typhoid, or cholera. This is the primary reason why ale and beer were the drinks of choice. The boiling during the brewing process sterilized the water, making it the safest source of hydration around. And what about bathing? Surely, they used water for that. Rarely. The prevailing medical theory, inherited from the ancient physician Galen, was that bathing opened the pores of the skin, making you vulnerable to bad air, or miasmas, which were believed to cause disease. So, being dirty was seen as a form of protection, a filth armor, against sickness. This stands in stark contrast to other parts of the world at the time, like the Islamic world, where bathhouses, hammams, were centers of hygiene and social life. Public bathhouses, or stews, did exist in some European towns, but they quickly developed a reputation for being centers of prostitution and debauchery, and the church actively campaigned to shut them down. For the average person, a full bath was a monumental undertaking involving hauling and heating gallons of water. Most people made do with a quick splash of the hands and face. Since everyone smelled of sweat, dirt, and wood smoke, your own personal odor was simply part of the ambient background noise of life. So next time you turn on a tap, spare a thought for your ancestors, for whom a simple drink of water was a life-or-death gamble. Inevitably, you get sick. Maybe it's a fever from that water you drank, or an infection in a cut on your hand. You need a doctor. What you get is a man who believes your body is a container of 4 liquids that need balancing. Welcome to the world of humoral theory. Your health depended on the perfect balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every illness was diagnosed as an imbalance. University-trained physicians would consult complex astrological charts, as it was believed that the planets and zodiac signs governed different parts of the body. The zodiac man was a common medical diagram showing this relationship. Got a fever? You're clearly too hot and moist, an excess of blood. The cure? Bloodletting. The barber surgeon would make an incision or apply leeches to drain the excess blood, weakening you further. Feeling depressed or melancholic? An overabundance of black bile. The prescription would be laxatives and a diet of hot and moist foods to counteract the cold, dry nature of your ailment. Surgery was a terrifying last resort. Performed without anesthetic, with tools that were merely wiped clean, not sterilized. They had no concept of germs. Doctors looked at pus in a wound and thought it was a good sign, a process they called laudable pus, believing it was the body expelling the bad humors. In reality, it was a raging infection. Visual aids like the wound man diagram showed a single figure afflicted with every possible injury, stabs, slashes, bites, as a grim guide for surgeons. In short, medieval medicine was like trying to fix a delicate machine by hitting it with a hammer and consulting an astrology chart. If you recovered, it was seen as a miracle from God. If you died, well, it was God's will. The doctor still got paid. After a long day of surviving your job and your doctor, it's time for the evening meal. You shuffle home, hoping for something, anything, to fill your stomach. Be careful what you wish for. Your dinner is playing a game of gastronomical Russian roulette with you. With no refrigeration, food preservation was a constant battle against decay. Meat was heavily salted, smoked, or pickled to make it last, but it often teetered on the edge of spoiling. Botulism was a constant, unnamed threat. Bread could be a danger too. In wet years, a fungus called ergot could grow on rye, and if baked into bread, it caused hallucinations, seizures, and a painful death, a condition known as St. Anthony's fire. Vegetables were seasonal and monotonous. Your diet would be a parade of turnips, cabbages, and onions. And if you were lucky enough to get meat, it was likely the humbles, the heart, liver, and intestines of an animal. This is the origin of the phrase, eating humble pie, which was literally a pie filled with deer offal. Foraging was essential for survival, adding nuts, berries, and wild greens to the diet, but it came with its own risks of misidentifying poisonous plants. And food wasn't just a health risk, it was a legal one. The deer in the forest, the fish in the river, they belonged to the Lord. These were protected by strict forest laws. If you were a peasant caught poaching a rabbit to feed your starving family, the punishment could be the loss of a hand, blinding, or even death. So as you sit down to your bland, grayish meal, you know that every bite is a gamble. But you eat it anyway. Because the only thing more dangerous than the food, was no food at all. The sun has set. You've survived another day. But don't relax just yet. The workday may be over, but the spiritual one never ends. God is watching. And so is the church. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't a choice you made on Sunday morning, it was the operating system for your entire reality. The parish church was the physical and social center of your village. It's where you were baptized, married, and buried. The church dictated the calendar, the law, and the rhythm of your day. The bells that woke you up also called you to prayer multiple times a day. Missing Mass was a sin. Working on a holy day was a sin. Having an impure thought was a sin. And hell was not an abstract concept, it was a terrifyingly real destination, described in graphic detail from the pulpit and depicted in gruesome, doom paintings, on the church walls. You couldn't read the Bible yourself, it was in Latin, the language of the clergy. You relied entirely on the priest's interpretation. This gave the church immense power. A failed harvest wasn't bad weather, it was God's punishment. The solution? Pray harder, and more importantly, pay pay your tithe, a mandatory 10% of everything you produced. Fear of the afterlife was a powerful motivator. Purgatory, a place where souls were purified before entering heaven, was a particular source of anxiety. But the church had a solution: indulgences. For a donation, you could buy a piece of paper that promised to shorten your time, or a relative's time, in fiery torment. And for the truly devout, there were relics, a sliver of the true cross, the finger bone of a saint. People would travel for hundreds of miles on pilgrimages, believing these objects held the power to heal and save. In this world, the church wasn't just a guide for your soul, it was your landlord, your judge, and your banker, and the rent was always due. If you thought life as a medieval peasant was a raw deal, try being a woman. It was like playing the game on the highest difficulty setting, with half the resources. From the moment she was born, a woman's path was largely predetermined. Her role was defined by her relationship to men: she was a daughter, a wife, or a widow. Under the legal principle of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was completely absorbed by her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, or sue in court without him. She was his property. Her primary duty was to produce heirs, specifically sons, to inherit land and titles. Childbirth was the most dangerous moment in a woman's life. With no understanding of germs or modern medicine, even a straightforward birth could end in tragedy. It was the leading cause of death for women. Yet, there were small pockets of female agency. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, could achieve a measure of economic independence. In convents, some women could receive an education and wield administrative power. A powerful noble widow could manage vast estates. But for the vast majority, life was one of silent endurance. An unmarried woman was viewed with suspicion. A childless widow was vulnerable. And an outspoken woman, especially one with knowledge of herbal remedies, could easily find herself accused of witchcraft. In a world of universal hardship, women bore the heaviest burden, and were expected to do so with quiet grace. You've navigated hunger, filth, and dogma. But there's one more element that defines medieval life: casual, brutal, and ever-present violence. Law and order were fragile concepts, often dependent on the mood of the local lord. Justice wasn't a system, it was divinely sanctioned improv theater. If you were accused of a crime, your guilt or innocence might be determined by trial by ordeal. You might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar. If your hand healed cleanly, God had declared you innocent. Or you could be thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty, as water, a pure element, was rejecting you. If you sank, you were innocent, but probably also dead. Punishments were public spectacles, designed to terrify the populace into submission. A thief could lose a hand. A gossip might be paraded through town in a scold's bridle. Others might be put in the stocks or the pillory, where the public was free to throw rotten food and refuse at them. Executions were popular entertainment. Families would gather to watch a hanging, a beheading, or for heretics, burning at the stake. Violence was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Street brawls were common. Feuds between noble families, essentially private wars, could last for generations. And if a lord decided to go on crusade, you might be conscripted to march 1,000 miles to a foreign land. You lived with the constant, low-humming awareness that your life could be ended abruptly over a stolen pig, a misunderstood glance, or simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You've made it. You've survived the fleas, the famines, the fevers, and the feuds. But now comes the final, unavoidable chapter: an early grave. If you lived past 40, you were considered ancient. You weren't a senior citizen, you were a marvel of biology, a walking relic. The average life expectancy was around 30 to 35, a number dragged down by staggering infant and child mortality. Nearly a third of children died before the age of 5. If you were lucky enough to reach adulthood, the world was still trying to kill you. For men, death often came from a farming accident, a festering wound, or the battlefield. For women, it was childbirth. For everyone, it was disease. The plague could sweep through and empty a village in a week. Famine could starve it over a winter. Death was so common that a whole genre of art, the danse macabre or dance of death, emerged. It depicted skeletons leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants, children, to their graves, a grim reminder that death was the great equalizer. People prepared for it meticulously. The ars moriendi, or the art of dying, taught people how to have a good death, to confess their sins, accept their fate, and die piously. Funerals were simple, hasty affairs. A wooden coffin was a luxury. Most were buried in a simple shroud in the churchyard, which was often so full that gravediggers would unearth old bones to make room for new bodies. You didn't plan for retirement. You planned for the end. Life was not a long, winding road. It was a short, treacherous path, and you were lucky if you made it to the end without falling off. So, how was your day? You woke up in a flea-infested hut, ate a bowl of perpetual gruel, worked until your body screamed, dodged fatal diseases, navigated a world of violence, and prayed your soul wouldn't end up in eternal torment. Still want to be a knight in shining armor? That gleaming, romanticized image of the Middle Ages is a beautiful lie, a story we tell ourselves because the truth is too muddy, too smelly, and too grim. Castles weren't cozy palaces, they were cold, drafty stone fortresses. The social hierarchy was brutally rigid. You were born into your station, and you died in it. The simpler times were not simple. They were an exhausting, relentless struggle for basic survival. And yet, and this is the most incredible part, people endured. They still fell in love, told stories around the fire, sang songs, celebrated harvests, and found moments of profound joy and faith amidst the squalor. They were not just statistics of suffering, they were resilient, stubborn, and profoundly human. They built cathedrals that still touch the sky, and they laid the foundations of the world we now inhabit. So tonight, when you climb into your clean, soft bed, in your climate-controlled home, with a pantry full of safe food and a medicine cabinet that works, take a moment. Acknowledge the quiet miracle of your modern life, and offer a silent nod of respect to your ancestors. They walked through the mud so that you, centuries later, could reach for the stars. Tonight, we're not just talking about history. We're traveling back to a time of gilded palaces and whispered conspiracies, of brilliant minds and brutal ambitions. We're going to talk about a woman who arrived in a frozen, foreign land as a teenage girl and left it as an empire builder, a philosopher queen, and a legend so powerful it still echoes today. But long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform, and an icon of sheer, unadulterated will, she was simply Sophie. Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst. It's a mouthful, isn't it? It sounds grand, but in the great lottery of 18th-century European nobility, it was a decidedly modest ticket. Born in 1729, she was the daughter of a minor German princely family whose domain, the Duchy of Anhalt-Zerbst in Pomerania, was little more than a postage stamp of a principality. It was a place that offered little in the way of real power, wealth, or influence. It was, to put it bluntly, the minor leagues. But Sophie herself? She was something else entirely. She was born with a set of assets that no title could ever bestow, a razor-sharp intellect that missed nothing, a quiet, observant charm that could disarm the most cynical courtier, and a silent, burning hunger for a life larger than the one she was born into. She wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth, she was born with a slightly less rusty than average iron one, and a steely determination to forge it into a scepter. Her upbringing was less a warm family portrait and more a cold, calculated training ground. Her mother, Johanna, was not a nurturing figure. She was a frustrated social climber, a woman obsessed with status, who viewed her daughter less as a child to be loved and more as a strategic asset to be deployed. Johanna was a stage mother from hell, convinced her daughter's ticket out of obscurity was a grand marriage, and she pushed Sophie relentlessly. Her father, a dutiful but emotionally distant Prussian officer, was more of a background character in her childhood, a man defined by his uniform and his absence. So, from a very young age, Sophie learned the delicate art of survival. She learned to navigate the treacherous currents of her mother's ambition, walking a fine line between quiet obedience and secret cunning. She devoured books, not for pleasure, but for fuel. She read voraciously, philosophy, history, poetry, and became fluent in multiple languages. She mastered the crucial courtly skill of observing everyone in a room before she ever dared to speak. These weren't hobbies, they were survival tools she was sharpening for a future she couldn't yet see, a future that would unfold in one of the most magnificent and brutal courts in all of Europe. That future began to crystallize when the Empress of Russia, Elizabeth Petrovna, started searching for a wife for her heir, the Grand Duke Peter. Elizabeth, a formidable ruler in her own right, had a problem. Her nephew and designated successor was difficult. And German. Peter himself was of German descent, a grandson of Peter the Great, but his heart and loyalties lay firmly with Prussia. Empress Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, believed a foreign bride, specifically, another German one, would be the best choice. A foreign girl would be pliable, grateful for the incredible elevation in status, and, most importantly, easier to control. She would have no family power base in Russia to challenge the throne. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. She had noble blood, a Lutheran faith she would be required to abandon, and a carefully cultivated reputation for both grace and humility. And so, at just 14 years old, the summons came. Sophie and her mother were called to Russia. They arrived in the frozen, glittering capital of St. Petersburg in the winter of 1744, shivering in their thin German fabrics but wearing perfectly diplomatic smiles. Her mother, Johanna, pushed her forward like a prize pawn in a high-stakes chess game. Sophie, however, was already thinking several moves ahead. She had her own game in mind. To become a true Russian, to be accepted not just by the court but by the people, she threw herself into her new identity with a ferocity that stunned everyone. She stayed up late into the night, studying the Russian language until her tongue ached and her German accent faded. She pored over the complex rituals of the Orthodox faith. In a dramatic public ceremony, she converted, shedding her old life and her old name. Sophie von Anhalt-Zerbst was gone. In her place stood Grand Duchess Ekaterina Alexeyevna. Catherine. The ceremony was a piece of grand political theater, symbolic and life-altering. She wasn't just changing her religion, she was setting fire to the bridge that connected her to her past. She was stepping into a vast, alien empire with no possibility of return. No one watching that quiet, serious teenage girl, wrapped in a fur-trimmed coat against the Russian cold, could have possibly predicted the hurricane of change she would unleash. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and the forging of an empire that would stretch across continents. But make no mistake. From the moment Sophie of Zerbst set foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn. And she began, ever so quietly, to plan how she would one day become the queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was supposed to be her coronation, the final step in securing her place in the opulent world of Russian royalty. But from the very beginning, it felt less like a crown and more like a beautifully gilded cage. Peter, the heir to the mighty Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of any fairy tale. He was, to be charitable, a mess. Awkward, deeply immature, and emotionally stunted, Peter was a man-child lost in a world of adult responsibility. His one true passion was not governance, nor his new wife, but his collection of toy soldiers. He would spend hours in his chambers arranging them, conducting elaborate war games, and staging mock military drills. There are accounts of him holding a formal court-martial for a palace rat that had chewed the head off one of his favorite sentinels, complete with a miniature gallows. This wasn't a hobby, it was an obsession, a retreat from a world he didn't understand and a role he didn't want. His affection for his wife was non-existent. In fact, he seemed to resent her. He flaunted his mistresses, spoke to her with open contempt, and, according to Catherine's own memoirs, refused to consummate the marriage for years. It was a union in name only, a cold, empty political contract. His other great love was for Frederick the Great of Prussia. He idolized the Prussian king, mimicking his mannerisms, wearing the Prussian uniform, and openly scorning the Russian court that had adopted him. He saw Russia as a barbaric, backward place he was forced to endure. In stark contrast, Catherine ran towards everything Peter ran away from. She embraced Russia with a fierce, calculated determination that bordered on obsession. While Peter was practicing his German drills, Catherine was perfecting her Russian. While he complained about the food, she was memorizing the names of saints and the intricate details of Orthodox rituals. While he dreamed of Berlin, she was studying the history of her new homeland. She understood a fundamental truth that Peter never grasped: to rule Russia, you first had to be Russian. He wanted to escape, she wanted to belong. This profound mismatch wasn't just an emotional void, it was a political powder keg. The Russian court of Empress Elizabeth was a treacherous landscape, a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. It was a ballet of bows and backstabs, where a kind word could hide a sharp knife and an alliance could dissolve overnight. Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was visibly declining. Everyone knew a transition of power was coming, and everyone was jockeying for position, placing their bets on who would come out on top. Catherine was a prisoner in this glittering fishbowl. She was watched constantly. Her letters were intercepted and read by the Chancellor. Her friendships were monitored. Her every word, every gesture, was scrutinized for hidden meaning. She couldn't trust her erratic husband, who might denounce her in a drunken fit. She couldn't trust her own mother, who remained at court for a time, acting as a clumsy and transparent spy for Prussian interests, eventually getting herself expelled for her intrigues. She couldn't even trust her servants, who might be paid to report on her. But Catherine was no naive victim. She was a quick study. She learned to play the court's dangerous games with a quiet, lethal grace. While her husband threw childish tantrums, she cultivated an image of dignity, piety, and restraint. She quietly began to build her own network of allies in the shadows. She charmed influential military officers from the elite Guards regiments, men who were disgusted by Peter's open contempt for the Russian army. She befriended scholars and artists, building a reputation as a woman of intellect. She won the sympathy of powerful courtiers who saw in her a stable, intelligent alternative to the volatile heir. And behind the closed doors of her private apartments, a different kind of education was taking place. Catherine began a secret affair, not just with a man, but with an idea. She started reading the great thinkers of the Enlightenment: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot. Their words about reason, justice, and the responsibilities of a monarch were a revelation. While others saw her as a pretty, tragic German consort, she was secretly building a blueprint. She was crafting a vision, not just for her own survival, but for the future of Russia itself, a nation built on strength, education, and modern principles. But there was one, very large, very inconvenient obstacle standing in her way: her husband. As long as Peter lived and was set to inherit the throne, Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man universally regarded as unfit to rule. The court whispered, the guards grumbled, and the nation held its breath. So Catherine did what she did best. She waited. She observed. And she planned. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the Russian throne wouldn't simply be inherited by someone like her. It would have to be taken. In the first days of 1762, the long wait ended. After nearly 2 decades of watching, maneuvering, and surviving, Catherine's moment arrived with the death of Empress Elizabeth. Her husband, Grand Duke Peter, was now Peter III, Tsar of all Russia. The power he had long, and perhaps reluctantly, awaited was finally his. And his reign began to unravel with a speed and self-destructive completeness that was almost comical, if it weren't so dangerous. In just 6 short months, Peter managed to alienate every significant power base in the entire empire. It was a masterclass in political suicide. First, the army. He immediately ended a successful war against his hero, Frederick the Great of Prussia, giving back hard-won territory without asking for anything in return. He then tried to force the proud imperial guards to adopt Prussian-style uniforms and drills, an insult that cut to the very core of their identity. The generals, many of whom had bled for Russia against Prussia, watched in stunned disbelief. Next, the church. He confiscated church lands, a move that enraged the powerful Orthodox clergy. He mocked their sacred rituals and openly favored Lutheranism, speaking of converting Russia's cathedrals. To the deeply devout Russian people, this was not just policy, it was sacrilege. Then, the nobility. He surrounded himself with his German friends from his home duchy of Holstein, giving them positions of power and privilege over seasoned Russian administrators. He behaved not like a Russian czar, but like a petty German duke who had inexplicably found himself in charge of a vast empire. And finally, there was Catherine. He publicly humiliated her, threatened to lock her away in a convent, and made it clear he intended to divorce her and marry his longtime mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova. For Catherine, this wasn't just an insult, it was a death sentence. To be cast aside meant a life of imprisonment, or worse. The clock was ticking. The court, already deeply wary of his erratic behavior, turned ice-cold. The army, filled with officers and regiments like the Preobrazhensky and Ismailovsky guards who were personally loyal to Catherine, grumbled in their barracks. Even ordinary Russians, patriotic and pious, began to see Peter as a foreign puppet, a fool who was mocking the very soul of their nation. Catherine, watching all of this unfold with the keen eye of a predator, knew her time had come. She didn't hesitate. In late June of 1762, while Peter was away at Oranienbaum, his summer palace outside St. Petersburg, she made her move. It was a coup d'état executed with breathtaking precision and audacity. The plan was orchestrated with her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his 4 influential brothers, a band of charismatic, ambitious, and utterly fearless military officers. In the pre-dawn hours, Alexei Orlov, the most daring of the brothers, woke Catherine and reportedly told her, "It is time to arise. All is prepared for your proclamation." She rode through the streets of St. Petersburg, not in a carriage, but on horseback, dressed in the uniform of an officer of the Preobrazhensky Guard. It was a brilliant piece of political theater. She wasn't a German princess asking for power, she was a Russian colonel taking command. One by one, the key guard regiments declared their allegiance. The clergy blessed her ascension at the Kazan Cathedral. The Senate proclaimed her Empress Catherine II, autocrat of all Russia. By the time the sun was high in the sky, she held the capital. The coup was essentially bloodless. Peter, caught completely off guard, was paralyzed by indecision. His advisors gave him conflicting advice: fight, flee, negotiate. He did a little of each, and all of them poorly. Without the support of the elite guards, he was powerless. Within days, he surrendered, abdicated the throne, and was taken into custody. A week later, he was dead. The official report, circulated for public consumption, was a medical absurdity. He had died from a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplectic stroke. No one believed it. Unofficially, and almost certainly, he was murdered, likely strangled during a drunken brawl with his guards, led by Alexei Orlov. Whether Catherine ordered the murder directly remains one of history's great, dark questions. But she certainly benefited from it, and she protected the killers. And so, it was done. Catherine was empress. Not by birth. Not by marriage. But by sheer force of will, political genius, and ruthless audacity. It was an astonishing feat a foreign-born woman with no legitimate blood claim to the throne had seized control of the Russian Empire without a single battle being fought. But her real challenge was just beginning. The crown was on her head, but it rested precariously. She had to transform a bold, illegal grab for power into a stable, lasting legacy. Would the nobility, who helped her rise, accept her as their absolute master? Could she hold this vast empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her unfortunate husband? Catherine understood that power gained through conspiracy could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a German schemer, but as a Russian visionary. And so began her great transformation, from a careful conspirator into a reforming empress, one who would redraw the map of Europe, embrace the fire of the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have simply enjoyed the spoils. She could have spent her days in lavish balls and her nights with handsome young guardsmen, content to be the absolute ruler of a vast empire. But Catherine didn't just want to sit on the throne, she had something far more ambitious in mind. She wanted to transform Russia. Not just its borders or its army, but its very mind and soul. While her late husband, Peter, had worshipped the military precision of Frederick the Great, Catherine idolized the intellectual fire of Voltaire, Diderot, and the other great thinkers of the French Enlightenment. She was captivated by their belief in reason, progress, human dignity, and the role of a monarch as a first servant of the state. It was a radical concept for an autocrat, a ruler whose power was, in theory, absolute and God-given. But Catherine saw no contradiction. She would be a philosopher on the throne. She didn't just read their books, she entered into a dialogue with them. She began a famous correspondence with Voltaire that would last for over 15 years. Their letters were a masterclass in intellectual flirtation. She would flatter him, calling him her teacher, while skillfully defending her own autocratic rule as necessary for a country as vast and untamed as Russia. She invited Denis Diderot, the co-founder of the Great Encyclopedia, to her court. When he fell on hard times, she bought his entire library for a generous sum, appointed him its librarian for life, and paid him a 50-year salary in advance. It was both an act of genuine intellectual patronage and a brilliant piece of public relations. But this was more than just a hobby. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated political theory, and began to craft policies aimed at dragging Russia into the modern world. Her first great project was an attempt to codify Russia's chaotic and ancient legal system. In 1767, she convened the Legislative Commission, a massive assembly of over 500 delegates drawn from every social class, except the serfs, and every corner of her empire. It was a kind of proto-parliament, an unprecedented gathering intended to create a new, rational legal code for all of Russia. To guide them, Catherine wrote her famous nakaz, or instruction. This document was nothing short of a political manifesto, heavily borrowing from Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws and Beccaриa's On Crimes and Punishments. It spoke of principles like equality before the law, the abolition of torture and capital punishment, and the fundamental responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an absolute monarch in 18th-century Russia, this was revolutionary stuff. The delegates were stunned. Some were inspired, many were horrified. But the bright, shining ideals of the Enlightenment had to survive contact with the harsh realities of Russia. This was a vast, deeply conservative, feudal society. Its economy ran on the labor of millions of serfs, who were essentially the property of the nobility. And those nobles, the very class that had put Catherine on the throne, liked their serfs exactly where they were, powerless, tied to the land, and under their absolute control. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, understood this perfectly. This was her great balancing act. The philosopher queen in public, the shrewd political operator in private. She walked a tightrope between enlightened ideology and political survival. She did manage some concrete reforms. She restricted the use of torture, expanded access to secular education, and founded new schools, including the famous Smolny Institute for Noble Girls. But on the single most important issue, serfdom, she not only failed to act, but in some ways made things worse. She reaffirmed the nobility's total control over their serfs, granting them even more power as a way to keep them loyal to her throne. She was trying to install brand new, cutting-edge software, the Enlightenment, onto very old, very stubborn hardware, feudal Russia. And the system kept crashing. The Legislative Commission itself descended into squabbling and achieved almost nothing before Catherine dissolved it under the pretext of a new war with Turkey. Her vision for Russia was bold, but it was always calculated. She wasn't truly trying to make Russia into a copy of France or England. She was trying to make Russia modern, but on her own terms. That meant a more efficient state, a more educated elite, and a more rational system of governance. But it would all be directed from the top down. It meant reform, yes, but always with an iron hand tucked inside a velvet glove. Catherine the Great wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. An empire, she believed, was a living thing. If it wasn't growing, it was dying. She wanted to expand Russia's borders outward, to make it an empire so vast and powerful that it would be worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had famously opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls and stride through as an equal. Under her leadership, Russia's armies marched, and its borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not just to defend her crown, but to fundamentally reshape the map of Europe and the balance of power. One of her most significant and prolonged campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s, 70s, and 80s, weren't just about grabbing territory. They were about fulfilling a long-held Russian dream. Catherine saw herself as the rightful protector of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule in the Balkans. She even harbored a grandiose vision known as the Greek Project, a plan to dismantle the Ottoman Empire entirely, restore Constantinople to Christian hands, and place her own grandson, appropriately named Constantine, on the throne of a new Byzantine Empire. Under brilliant and ruthless generals like Alexander Suvorov and her own partner, Grigory Potemkin, Russia's armies won stunning victories. They captured key regions, most importantly the Crimean Peninsula, giving Russia its first major foothold on the Black Sea. This was the prize Russian Tsars had coveted for generations, access to warm water ports, which would allow the Russian Navy to become a year-round force in the Mediterranean and beyond. These victories weren't just military, they were profoundly symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a clear message to the courts of Europe: Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin. It was a continental superpower. She also turned her sharp, calculating gaze westward, towards the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland, once a mighty kingdom, was now politically paralyzed, weakened by an unworkable system where any single nobleman could veto the entire parliament. Catherine, along with the rulers of Prussia and Austria, saw an opportunity. In a series of cynical diplomatic deals and military interventions, they acted like vultures circling a dying beast. They engineered the three partitions of Poland in 1772, 1793, and 1795. With each partition, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved off another slice of Polish territory for themselves. By the end of the third partition, the nation of Poland was completely erased from the map of Europe, not to reappear for more than a century. Russia claimed the lion's share, absorbing vast new lands in what is now Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania, along with millions of new subjects. In a cruelly personal twist, the King of Poland during this dismemberment was Stanislaw Poniatowski, a man who had once been one of Catherine's lovers, placed on the throne with her support. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies, she also colonized with ideas and people. New cities, like Odessa and Sevastopol, were founded on the shores of the Black Sea. Trade routes were expanded. To cultivate the vast, empty steppes of the south, she invited German settlers, promising them land, freedom of religion, and exemption from military service. The empire became a sprawling, multi-ethnic mosaic, stretching from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched coast of Crimea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central, driving force. She was no figurehead monarch. She was a micromanager, reading military reports, issuing detailed orders, and personally overseeing the grand strategy of her expanding empire. Critics, then and now, would accuse her of being a power-hungry imperialist, a ruthless aggressor. But in her own mind, this expansion wasn't mere ambition. It was Russia's destiny, and her duty. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by their philosophy, but by the length of their borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it into a truly great, civilized, and formidable empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and unbreakably loyal to her alone. For all her intellectual brilliance and geopolitical power, Catherine the Great was just as famous, or perhaps infamous, for what went on behind the gilded doors of the Winter Palace. And no, not all of it involved debating philosophy or redrawing maps. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about, scandal-plagued, and mythologized aspects of her entire reign. She had lovers. Not just one or two, but a carefully curated, rotating parade of them. They were often handsome, often decades younger than her, and sometimes, very politically influential. She didn't hide them away in shame. In a move that shocked the rest of Europe, she treated her favorites as a recognized, almost official position at court. When a lover was in favor, she showered him with titles, estates, serfs, and pensions. When he ceased to please her, he was politely but firmly dismissed, often with a generous parting gift, a golden parachute, to ensure his silence and comfort. Among the long list of these men, one stood head and shoulders above all others, Grigory Potemkin. He was a man as brilliant, as bold, and as complex as Catherine herself. Their relationship was a fiery, passionate, and deeply intellectual partnership that blurred the lines between romance, politics, and co-rule. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, he was her most trusted advisor, her top general, and her partner in the colossal project of colonizing and developing southern Russia, the lands newly conquered from the Turks. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Their bond was so profound that even after their romantic passion cooled, they remained lifelong friends and indispensable allies, with Potemkin even helping to vet his own successors for the Empress's affections. Still, the rest of Europe couldn't look past the scandal. In the courts of Paris, London, and Vienna, gossip swirled. Cruel, satirical pamphlets and cartoons were printed, painting her as a lustful, insatiable, and morally depraved nymphomaniac. After her death, the rumors only grew more grotesque and absurd, culminating in the most infamous lie in royal history, the completely false and vile story that she died while attempting to have sexual relations with a horse. This disgusting tale was pure political slander, likely invented by her enemies to smear her legacy by transforming a powerful female ruler into a figure of sexual degeneracy. But why the obsessive focus on her love life? The answer is simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded absolute power as unapologetically as any male king. And in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins like England's Elizabeth I, or tragic, victimized wives, Catherine refused to play either role. She lived, loved, and ruled entirely on her own terms, and that independence made her both fascinating and dangerous to the patriarchal order of the day. Ironically, while her critics painted her as an immoral monster, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural and healthy part of life, and she saw no reason why her personal relationships should threaten her public responsibilities. She masterfully separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers ever managed. In reality, her liaisons were often highly strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were ambitious, capable, and, above all, loyal to her personally, rather than to some abstract idea of the crown or to a rival court faction. They were her creations, and their power depended entirely on her favor. And when they ceased to be useful, or when the passion faded, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement plan. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule, it was an integral part of her strategy. It was a unique and powerful blend of personal passion and political power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. For all her charisma, political skill, and tight control, Catherine's reign was not without peril. The foundations of her empire were built on a system of brutal inequality, and in 1773, that foundation began to shake violently. The peril came in the form of a charismatic, bearded Don Cossack named Yemelian Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev made a claim so audacious, so insane, that it could only have taken root in a land desperate for a miracle. He claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's long-dead husband. According to his story, he had miraculously survived the coup and the assassination attempt, and had been wandering the land in disguise, waiting for the right moment to return and reclaim his throne from the German usurper, Catherine. It was, of course, absurd. Peter III was long gone, his body buried. But to Russia's vast population of oppressed serfs, disgruntled Cossacks, factory workers, and religious minorities, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer a glimmer of hope. Pugachev promised a vision of the world turned upside down. He promised total liberation for the serfs, an end to crushing taxes and military conscription, and land for the common people. He declared a war on the nobles, vowing to hang them from the nearest tree. His words were like a match thrown into a dry forest. A fire of rebellion raged across the Volga River region, spreading with terrifying speed. For people whose lives were defined by hardship and subjugation, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev rebellion became the largest and bloodiest peasant uprising in Russian history. Entire towns fell to his rebel army. Fortresses were taken. Nobles and their families were brutally slaughtered. For a terrifying year and a half, it seemed as if the empire itself might fracture. Pugachev's forces, though poorly equipped, were vast and fanatically motivated. Catherine, in her palace in St. Petersburg, was profoundly shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with disciplined cavalry and clever treaties. This was a revolt from within, a visceral howl of rage from her own people rising up against the very system she ruled. It was a direct challenge not just to her authority, but to the entire social order. But Catherine didn't panic. She acted. After initial government responses proved shockingly ineffective, she dispatched her best professional military forces under her top generals to crush the rebellion with overwhelming and ruthless force. Pugachev's peasant army was no match for the disciplined Russian military machine. They were systematically defeated in 1774. Pugachev himself was betrayed by his own followers and handed over to the authorities. He was transported to Moscow in a cramped iron cage, put on public display as a warning to all. In a grim public spectacle in January 1775, he was executed, beheaded and then drawn and quartered. The rebellion was over, but it left a deep and permanent scar on Catherine. Her dreams of one day liberating the serfs, inspired by her Enlightenment readings, quietly faded into silence. The uprising had shown her the terrifyingly thin veneer of civilization that covered the deep, violent chasm of Russian society. It revealed the limits of philosophy in a country still shackled by a brutal feudal system. This was a major turning point in her reign. The empress who once quoted Voltaire and spoke of legal equality now prioritized order and stability above all else. Reform became far more cautious, aimed at strengthening the state, not liberating the people. Surveillance and internal controls increased. She now leaned even harder on the nobility, granting them a charter that confirmed all their privileges, including their absolute power over their serfs, in exchange for their unwavering loyalty. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a chilling warning that haunted Catherine for the rest of her life, that power built on profound inequality could only hold for so long before the storm came crashing through the gates. By the time Catherine the Great approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, a reign longer than any other female ruler in the nation's history. From the moment she seized power as a young woman, she had consistently defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and fundamentally redefined what a monarch, and a woman, could achieve. Her legacy, first and foremost, was drawn on the map. Under Catherine's command, the Russian Empire became a true European and global powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, an area larger than modern-day France. She swallowed Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and vast swathes of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These were not just military victories, they were strategic masterstrokes that secured crucial warm water ports, reshaped Eurasian trade routes, and projected Russian power into the Mediterranean and the heart of Europe. But her legacy wasn't only written in blood and territory. Catherine left a deep and indelible cultural mark as well. She was the founder of the magnificent Hermitage Museum, beginning with her own private purchase of 225 paintings from a Berlin merchant. Over her reign, she amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe. Her court, once considered a provincial backwater, became a glittering center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as barbaric and backward by Western Europeans, Catherine put Russia firmly on the cultural map. She championed the modernization of education, founding the first state-funded schools for girls and promoting the printing of books and journals. In a remarkable act of scientific bravery and public leadership, she introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia. To quell public fear of the new and terrifying procedure, she had herself and her son, Paul, publicly vaccinated, setting an example that saved countless lives. Yet, for all her achievements, her reign was a tapestry woven with brilliant threads and dark contradictions. The most glaring of these was the chasm between her ideals and her actions. She passionately admired the Enlightenment's call for liberty and human dignity, yet she never freed the serfs. In fact, her policies extended and deepened the institution of serfdom, entrenching the power of the nobility and leaving millions in a state of virtual slavery. Her reforms, while impressive, remained mostly top-down affairs, designed to polish the facade of the empire and make the state more efficient, without truly transforming its oppressive foundations. Still, what Catherine's rule brought to Russia was stability, strength, and a powerful sense of national purpose. She understood a core truth of power: it is not inherited, it is crafted. It must be managed, defended, and wielded with constant vigilance. She ruled not by divine right, a claim she could never truly make, but by sheer force of will, unparalleled political brilliance, and relentless, round-the-clock calculation. She was called many things in her lifetime: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a visionary, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died of a stroke in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, more educated, and more formidable than it had been at any point in its history. She left behind a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a personal legend that would endure for centuries. Catherine didn't just reign over Russia. She ruled it, with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on the levers of history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her imperial power, military expansion, and enduring legacy, Catherine the Great was still, at her core, a woman navigating a world built by and for men, and reshaping it in her own image. Behind the magnificent imperial portraits and the powerful state decrees was a person deeply, acutely aware of how precarious her position was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a violent coup. She was a woman ruling an empire that had no tradition of, and little appetite for, a female autocrat. And yet, she did not merely endure, she triumphed. Catherine was never content to be an ornamental figurehead. Her work ethic was legendary. Her daily schedule was grueling, beginning at dawn and ending late at night. It was filled with hours of reading state reports, personally corresponding with foreign leaders, editing legal drafts, and managing a court teeming with rival factions and ambitious schemers. She didn't just sit on the throne, she worked the throne, with the dedication of a stateswoman who knew she had to outthink, outmaneuver, and outwork everyone around her just to stay alive. In many ways, she was also profoundly lonely. She surrounded herself with courtiers, artists, philosophers, and lovers, yet she wrote in her private memoirs of how few people she could ever truly trust. Her relationship with her son and heir, Paul, was a source of constant anxiety. She distrusted him, kept him far away from the levers of state power, and feared, correctly, as it turned out, that he would grow into a man who would try to undo all of her progress out of sheer spite. Her greatest emotional and intellectual partnership, with Grigory Potemkin, eventually faded from passion into a deep and abiding friendship, but his death in 1791 left a void, a wound that never truly healed. Catherine was a master of public relations long before the term existed. She carefully and deliberately crafted her own image, understanding the power of narrative better than almost any monarch of her age. She posed for portraits as the wise lawgiver, the mother of the fatherland. She dressed in military uniform as the warrior empress. She corresponded with Voltaire to present herself as the enlightened monarch. But beneath all of these carefully constructed roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, public scandal, and violent rebellion, and had simply kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also a legacy riddled with questions. Could she have done more to end the scourge of serfdom? Were her enlightened ideals ultimately compromised and hollowed out by the brutal realities of power politics? Was she more of a reformer or more of a tyrant? History remembers her by the title she never gave herself, but which posterity bestowed upon her, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless, or kind, or just. It was because she was formidable. It was because she took power when she had no right to it, and wielded it on her own terms in a time and place where women were supposed to have none. She didn't just wear the crown. She rewrote the very definition of what it meant to deserve one. A story about a queen, a lost name, and a silence that has echoed for more than 1,000 years. It begins, as so many great mysteries do, deep within a jungle, in a place where the ghosts of an empire still whisper through the stone. Imagine yourself in the Chiapas highlands of southern Mexico. The air here is not just air, it's a living thing, thick with the scent of damp earth, blooming orchids, and decay. It's so humid you can practically drink it. Above you, a canopy of green so dense it blots out the sun, and the only sounds are the prehistoric roars of howler monkeys and the incessant, electric thrum of insects. This is the world of the ancient Maya, and rising from the jungle floor like the bones of a sleeping giant are the ruins of Palenque. For centuries, Palenque was a thriving city-state, a hub of art, astronomy, and political power. Its pyramids and palaces weren't just buildings, they were cosmic maps, stone monuments built to align with the stars and the gods. But by the 9th century, the city was abandoned, swallowed by the relentless green tide of the jungle, and its stories were forgotten. For 1,000 years, it slept. Now, fast forward to 1994. The ruins are a world-famous archaeological site, a puzzle that generations of scholars have tried to piece together. Our story focuses on a team of Mexican archaeologists, led by a sharp and determined woman named Fanny Lopez Jimenez. They weren't working on the main attractions, not the soaring temple of the inscriptions where the legendary king, Kinich Janab Pakal, was found. Instead, they were investigating a much smaller, almost overlooked structure right next to it, a pyramid known simply as Temple 13. By all accounts, Temple 13 was the B-list celebrity of Palenque. It was structurally important but lacked the grandeur of its neighbor. No one expected to find a king inside. But archaeology is a science of patience, of looking where others haven't. As Fanny's team meticulously surveyed the temple, they were doing what archaeologists do best, listening to the stones. Tapping floors, checking for structural oddities, searching for the slightest hint of something out of place. And they found it. A section of the floor that sounded hollow. A hidden patch of masonry that didn't quite fit. Beneath it, they discovered a narrow, rubble-filled passageway, untouched for centuries. This was the moment that quickens the pulse of every explorer, every historian. The passage had never been breached. No looters had found their way in. Whatever was down there had been sealed away since the day it was consecrated. After weeks of painstaking work, clearing the debris one stone at a time, they finally broke through into a small, dark chamber. The air that rushed out to greet them was ancient, heavy with the scent of lime plaster and something else, something metallic and earthy. As they lowered a light into the darkness, it illuminated a sight that would change Maya history forever. There, in the center of the room, sat a monolithic limestone sarcophagus. It was plain, unadorned, but its presence spoke volumes. It was a royal tomb. But whose? As they worked to lift the heavy stone lid, a fine, impossibly vibrant dust began to cloud the air. It wasn't brown or gray. It was red. A brilliant, shocking, crimson red. When the lid was finally removed, the dust billowed out like a puff of dragon's breath, a silent, scarlet explosion. The entire interior of the sarcophagus was coated in it. And nestled within this bed of crimson lay the delicate, fragile skeleton of a woman. Her body had been arranged with the utmost care. A funeral mask made of shimmering green jade and obsidian covered her face. More jade, in the form of necklaces, diadems, and ear spools, adorned her body. This was, without a doubt, one of the richest and most reverent female burials ever discovered in the Mesoamerican world. Everything about it screamed power, divinity, and importance. Yet, there was a profound, almost defiant silence. Not a single glyph was carved on the sarcophagus. No inscriptions on the walls identified her. She was a queen without a name, a ghost in a cloud of red. The archaeologists, in a moment of poetic inspiration, gave her a title that has stuck ever since, the Red Queen. But who was she? And why was her memory entrusted not to words, but to a color? The most defining, most haunting feature of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't the priceless jade or the eons of silence. It was the color. That thick, pervasive layer of powdered cinnabar that covered everything, the sarcophagus, the walls, her very bones. It clung to the stone like a memory of blood. For us, red is a color of many things: love, anger, a stop sign. For the Maya, its meaning was far more profound and far more dangerous. This red powder was cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury sulfide. To get it, you have to find and crush a specific type of reddish rock, a process that released a substance both beautiful and deadly. In the Maya worldview, the color red was the sacred essence of life itself. It was the color of the rising sun in the east, the direction of birth and beginnings. It was the color of blood, the precious fluid offered in sacrifices to nourish the gods. It was the ultimate symbol of rebirth, the promise that life could emerge from death, just as the sun emerged from the darkness of the underworld each morning. So, to cover a body in cinnabar was not just decoration. It was a potent act of ritual magic. It was a declaration that this person was not merely being buried, they were being transformed. In Maya cosmology, death wasn't a final destination. It was a journey, a perilous crossing into a different plane of existence called Xibalba, the underworld. The Red Queen was being prepared for that journey, her earthly form saturated with the color of divine energy, essentially being supercharged for the transition from mortal to ancestor, or perhaps even to a god. But there's a fascinating and grim scientific layer to this sacred practice. Cinnabar is highly toxic. It's mercury. Prolonged contact or inhalation leads to mercury poisoning, a horrific condition that causes tremors, muscle weakness, hallucinations, and eventually, death. The Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland fame was a real phenomenon, based on the 19th century hat makers who used mercury to process felt and slowly went insane. The Maya priests who handled this much cinnabar, who ground it into powder and carefully painted it over the Red Queen's body, were engaging in an act of extreme devotion and extreme risk. They likely didn't understand the chemistry, but they absolutely understood its power. They felt its volatile, dangerous energy. It was a substance that blurred the line between the sacred and the lethal. To bathe a corpse in it was a statement. It declared that this person was so important, so powerful, that their transition required the use of one of the most potent and hazardous materials known to their world. In Palenque, this honor was incredibly rare. In fact, only one other primary burial has been found with this same intense cinnabar saturation, that of Pakal the Great, the king who reigned during Palenque's golden age and was buried in the Grand Temple right next door. This detail was the first major clue in the Red Queen's mystery. The fact that she and the most powerful king in the city's history shared this unique, dangerous, and sacred burial rite immediately suggested a deep connection. Was she his wife? His mother? Someone of equal, or near equal, spiritual standing? The tomb offered other clues. Her skull rested on a pillow, but not one of soft feathers. It was a layer of jaguar skin, the fragmented remains still detectable after a millennium. The jaguar, the apex predator of the jungle, was a symbol of royal power, shamanic strength, and the night sun. Around her body, archaeologists found a collection of exquisitely carved bone needles, sharp obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines. These were not just trinkets, they were instruments of ritual, echoes of ceremonies performed in her honor, a story told not with words, but with objects. Each piece, and especially the all-encompassing red, was a syllable in a silent language of power. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-dusted remains was a trove of offerings, a silent testament to her status. These were not simply pretty objects meant to decorate a grave. In the Maya worldview, they were essential equipment, a spiritual toolkit for the most dangerous journey a soul could ever undertake. Let's unpack her otherworldly luggage. At her sides, archaeologists found heavy necklaces of jade, their polished green surfaces still cool and radiant after 1,300 years in the dark. Today, we associate wealth with gold and diamonds. For the Maya, jade was the ultimate treasure. It was more valuable than gold because its significance was not just material, but profoundly spiritual. Jade was called tun, a word that also meant stone or seed. Its brilliant green color was the color of young maize shoots, the crop that was the very source of life for the Maya people. It was the color of the quetzal bird's feathers, the most prized decorative element in Mesoamerica. It was the color of the jungle, a symbol of eternal vitality. The Maya believed jade held the essence of water and breath, the very soul force of the universe. To be buried in jade was to be wrapped in the promise of everlasting life. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, her wrists, her ears, a clear sign that she was a person of immense influence, someone who literally wore the symbols of divinity. But perhaps the most intimate and haunting object was the funerary mask placed delicately over what remained of her face. It wasn't a solid piece of metal like Tutankhamun's golden mask. Instead, it was a complex mosaic, crafted from hundreds of tiny, hand-cut tiles of jade, shell, and obsidian, meticulously arranged to follow the contours of her face. This wasn't just a portrait, it was a piece of spiritual technology. The mask served to protect the soul on its journey, to preserve the wearer's identity in the chaotic underworld, and to present her to the gods not as a decaying corpse, but as a perfected, divine being. It was a new, eternal face for her new, eternal life. Scattered near her bones were other, more enigmatic items. A collection of bone needles and obsidian lancets. These were likely not for sewing clothes. They were instruments of auto-sacrifice, a common and deeply important ritual among the Maya elite. By piercing their own tongues, ears, or other body parts, nobles would offer their own blood, their personal life force, to the gods. These objects in her tomb may have been symbolic, representing the rituals she herself performed as a high-ranking priestess or royal matriarch, or they may have been used in a final ceremony at her funeral to empower her spirit. One bone pin was even faintly engraved, a tiny, almost lost echo of a life we can no longer hear. And finally, at her feet and along the edges of the sarcophagus were ceramic vessels, still sealed. They likely once held offerings of food and drink to sustain her on the arduous path through Xibalba. Think of it as packing a lunch for eternity. These might have contained tamales, maize porridge, or perhaps a sacred beverage like balch or hot chocolate, which was considered a drink of the gods. What is striking about her tomb is its focused intimacy. There's no grand display of worldly wealth in the way we might think of it. No gold, no chariots, no vast quantities of pottery. Every single object feels chosen, intentional, and spiritually significant. It's less a treasure chest and more a ritual map for the soul. Through these objects, we can see how the Maya understood death, not as an ending, but as a critical transition of power. The Red Queen wasn't being buried to be forgotten. She was being equipped to ascend. For all the splendor of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one gaping, frustrating void, her name. No glorious inscriptions, no carved glyphs on the walls, no painted text on the sarcophagus. In a civilization that meticulously recorded the names and deeds of its rulers, this absence is deafening. She was clearly one of the most important people in Palenque, yet she was officially anonymous. So, who was she? From the moment her tomb was opened, the detective work began. The most compelling and widely accepted theory is that the Red Queen was a woman named Nine Tiziak Buajah, the wife of the great King Pakal. Tiziak was a formidable figure in her own right. Born into a noble family in a nearby town, she married into Palenque's royal dynasty at a young age, a strategic alliance to solidify the city's power. She was more than just a consort, she was the mother of kings. She bore Pakal at least 3 sons, 2 of whom would go on to rule Palenque themselves, continuing the dynasty she helped secure. Inscriptions found elsewhere in the city show her participating in key religious ceremonies, a clear indicator of her high status. If anyone in Palenque deserved a burial of this magnificence, it was her. The circumstantial evidence is incredibly strong. First, there's the location. Her tomb in Temple 13 is just a stone's throw away from Pakal's own Grand Pyramid. In the sacred geography of a Maya city, this is no coincidence. It's like being buried in a family plot, but on a cosmic scale. The proximity strongly implies a deliberate and intimate pairing, husband and wife, rulers united even in death. Then there's the cinnabar. As we've discussed, this unique and dangerous ritual was reserved for the highest of the high. The fact that only Pakal and the Red Queen received this full-body, crimson treatment in Palenque is perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence linking them. It's a shared ritual signature, a sign that they were seen as a matched pair in the spiritual realm. With all this evidence pointing to Tiziak, scientists turn to modern forensics for the final confirmation. They managed to extract ancient DNA from the bones of both the Red Queen and Pakal, hoping for a definitive link. The results, however, were both fascinating and frustrating. They were inconclusive. The analysis showed that the Red Queen was not Pakal's direct maternal relative. This ruled out the theory that she might be his mother, a powerful ruler named Lady Sak-Kuk. But it did not rule out her being his wife. After all, one does not typically share maternal DNA with one's spouse. The DNA was too degraded by the jungle's humidity to build a more complex family tree. So, science gave us an answer, but not the answer. This leaves the door open for other, less likely theories. Could she have been a high priestess of unparalleled authority? A sister or another royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to the erosion of time? It's possible. Still, the weight of the evidence, the proximity, the shared cinnabar ritual, her age at death, around 60, and the timeline, all point most strongly to Tiziak, the queen consort and mother of future kings. The lack of a name may not be an oversight or a puzzle for us to solve. It might have been intentional. In the Maya worldview, the soul lived on not through stone monuments, but through ritual, through memory, and through the cosmic cycles of the earth. Perhaps by leaving her nameless, her builders were allowing her spirit to become one with the sacred landscape itself, untethered to a single identity. And so the Red Queen remains, suspended between history and legend, a woman who ruled, remembered not in words, but in scarlet and silence. To truly grasp the significance of the Red Queen, we must step back and understand the world she inhabited, a world where royal Maya women wielded far more power and influence than was once believed. For a long time, Western historians, viewing ancient civilizations through a patriarchal lens, assumed that Maya society was rigidly male-dominated. Kings were kings, and queens were, at best, their quiet, decorative consorts. But archaeology and the decipherment of Maya glyphs have shattered that simplistic view. In reality, Maya politics was a family business, and royal women were essential players. They weren't passive figures waiting in the palace. They were diplomats, priestesses, strategic marriage partners, and sometimes, rulers in their own right. Their bloodlines were a form of political currency, used to forge powerful alliances between city-states and legitimize a king's claim to the throne. A king's power wasn't just based on his own strength, it was often validated by the prestige of the woman he married. Take, for example, Lady Sak-Kuk, the mother of Pakal the Great. When Palenque's throne was left vacant after a period of political turmoil, she didn't just step aside for a male relative. She took power herself. She ruled as queen regent for several years until her son, Pakal, was old enough to take the throne. And even then, she didn't just disappear. The iconography shows her personally handing the crown to her son, a powerful visual statement that his authority flowed directly through her. She wasn't a placeholder, she was the source of his legitimacy. And she was not an anomaly. Across the Maya world, we find evidence of other powerful women. In the city of Yaxchilan, a series of stunningly carved lintels depicts Lady Zook, the principal wife of the king, engaging in intense bloodletting rituals, communicating directly with gods and ancestors. In Naranjo, a formidable queen known as Lady Six Sky arrived from another city, took control, and became a warrior queen, leading military campaigns and re-establishing her city's dominance. These women are depicted on stone stelae and murals dressed in elaborate regalia, sometimes standing as equals beside their husbands, their words and deeds recorded in glyphs for all to see. This vital context casts the Red Queen in a completely new light. The richness of her burial, its sacred nature, and its deliberate placement next to Pakal's tomb all suggest she was far more than just the king's wife. She was a central pillar of Palenque's royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just an ornament, it was a symbol of an identity so powerful it had to be preserved for eternity. Her bloodline, especially if she was Tz'ak Buajah, was the very glue that held Pakal's dynasty together by producing the next generation of rulers. By the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, this memory of powerful women had largely faded, eroded by the collapse of the classic Maya cities and later buried under a colonial worldview that saw indigenous women as subservient. But the archaeology tells a different, more complex story. The Red Queen's tomb is a physical rebuttal to that erasure. It proves that in her world, a queen was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in high ceremony, and a bridge between the human and divine realms. She may be nameless to us, but in her time, she was never voiceless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasures, she was buried in a treasure, an architectural one, rich with purpose and layered with the Maya understanding of the cosmos. Her tomb was not a simple grave. It was a gateway, a machine for eternity, and its design tells a story as profound as any of the objects within it. Her body was found deep inside Temple 13, a structure that, from the outside, seems modest compared to the towering pyramid of Pakal next door. But in the sacred urban planning of Palenque, nothing was random. The placement of these two temples, side by side, is a deliberate statement of connection. They are a matched pair, a dyad of power written in limestone. Temple 13 may be smaller, but it hides a secret of profound intimacy, a perfectly sealed crypt, a sacred space untouched by time or looters. To reach her, one must descend a steep, narrow staircase that plunges into the heart of the pyramid. This descent is not just a physical journey, it is a symbolic one. It mirrors the soul's ritual journey downward into the underworld, Xibalba. The air grows cooler, the light fades, and the sounds of the living world recede. You are entering a different realm. The burial chamber itself is stark and powerful. Unlike the tombs of some Egyptian pharaohs, its walls are not covered in elaborate murals or lengthy hieroglyphic texts telling the story of her life. The power here comes from its intentional silence. This was a space designed not for the living to come and read, but for the dead to undergo a sacred transformation. Its austerity focuses all attention on the central act, the body, the sarcophagus, and the ritual of rebirth. At the chamber's center sits her limestone coffin, a massive, single-block piece that echoes the grandeur of Pakal's, but in a more subdued, personal scale. While Pakal's famous sarcophagus lid is intricately carved with a complex scene of his fall into the maw of the underworld and his subsequent rebirth as the maize god, the Red Queen's tomb relies on a different kind of symbolism. The focus is internal, on the cinnabar, the jade, the body itself. And yet, there are subtle architectural cues that speak volumes. The tomb is aligned on an east-west axis. This is the path of the sun, the daily journey from its birth in the east to its symbolic death in the west before its journey through the underworld at night. By aligning her body with this path, her builders were plugging her soul directly into this cosmic cycle of death and resurrection. Maya temples were more than just buildings. They were living entities, cosmological models that connected the three layers of their universe, the heavens, the terrestrial world, and the underworld. To be buried within one was the ultimate honor, an act that elevated you beyond the merely human realm and integrated your spirit into the sacred machinery of the cosmos. The Red Queen's eternal home was not an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed shrine, a place where her death was meant to become a divine metamorphosis. Her bones may rest in stone, but her legacy is written in the very architecture of eternity. To the ancient Maya, death was not a full stop. It was a threshold, a doorway into a perilous and sacred journey through the underworld, known to them as Xibalba, the place of fright. For an elite individual like the Red Queen, this passage was not just a spiritual event, it was a cosmological and political one, requiring meticulous ritual preparation. Her entire burial was a masterclass in how to equip a soul for this ultimate test. Maya sacred texts, like the famous Popol Vuh, describe Xibalba not as a peaceful heaven or a fiery hell, but as a labyrinthine realm ruled by sinister gods of death. To get through it, a soul had to navigate treacherous obstacles, rivers of blood and pus, houses filled with shrieking bats, slashing obsidian knives, or hungry jaguars. It was a series of trials designed to destroy the unprepared. Only those who were properly buried, ritually fortified, and spiritually equipped could hope to survive the journey and be reborn into the celestial realm. Every item in the Red Queen's tomb was part of this preparation. The cinnabar that coated her body was like a spiritual armor, imbuing her with the sacred energy of life and rebirth. The jade mask was her passport, a way to preserve her identity and present a perfected face to the formidable lords of Xibalba. The ceramic vessels filled with food and drink were her provisions for the long road ahead. The presence of the bone needles and obsidian blades hints at the importance of sacrifice. Auto-sacrifice, or bloodletting, was a way for the living to communicate with and nourish the gods. By placing these symbolic tools in her tomb, her attendants may have been reenacting these rites, spiritually empowering her for the challenges to come. Other items, like potential stingray spines or shell trumpets, were tools of communication, ways to call upon divine aid or announce her royal presence in the other world. Burial was not a final goodbye, it was an act of transformation, akin to planting a seed. The Maya believed in endless cycles of creation, destruction, and rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly manifestations of deities, the king as an avatar of the sun god, the queen perhaps connected to the moon goddess. In death, they didn't just cease to be, they were expected to return to their divine origins. The Red Queen, drenched in the color of blood and sacrifice, entombed within the heart of a pyramid aligned with the cosmos, and honored with a suite of sacred offerings, was being prepared not for an end, but for a new beginning. She was being set on a path to be reborn, not as a mortal woman, but as a divine ancestor, a being forever tied to the sacred order of the universe. Her burial wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her apotheosis. Just a few paces from the Red Queen's tomb lies one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in the Americas, the tomb of Kinich Janab Pakal, or Pakal the Great. His burial, deep within the Temple of the Inscriptions, is a symphony of art, power, and mythology. But the true genius of the Red Queen's story is not just what was in her tomb, but where it was. Her sarcophagus was hidden in Temple 13, directly adjacent to Pakal's monument. This proximity is the final, and perhaps most powerful, clue to her identity and importance. In a city like Palenque, this wasn't a matter of convenience, it was a statement etched in stone. If the prevailing theory is correct, and the Red Queen is indeed Pakal's wife, Tiziak Buajah, then their burials represent two halves of a single, sacred narrative. The similarities are too striking to ignore. Both were entombed in the heart of a pyramid. Both were adorned with priceless jade. And most importantly, both were saturated in that rare and sacred cinnabar powder. Their funeral rites mirror each other, as if choreographed by the same master of ceremonies to tell a unified story. But there are also profound differences that highlight their complementary roles. Pakal's tomb is loud. Its famous sarcophagus lid is a detailed cosmic diagram, a piece of propaganda in stone that shouts his divine lineage and his destiny to be reborn as the maize god. It's an explicit, textual, and visual declaration of power. The Red Queen's tomb, by contrast, is quiet. It is powerful in its minimalism. There are no grand carvings, no lengthy texts. The symbolism lies not in iconography, but in substance and placement. If Pekel's tomb is a grand opera, hers is a silent, resonant poem. This leads to a beautiful and compelling theory of cosmic duality. If Pekel, as king, represented the sun, the masculine force that blazes across the daytime sky, then the Red Queen may have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious and powerful path through the night. Together, they embodied a fundamental principle of Mesoamerican thought: the universe is kept in balance by complementary opposites. Masculine and feminine. Day and night. Sun and moon. Life and death. In this view, rulership itself was not singular, it was relational. The harmony of the kingdom depended on the harmony of its ruling pair. The well-being of the cosmos required balance, and that balance was reflected in the dynastic court of Palenque. By placing the Red Queen's tomb beside Pekel's, the Maya were doing more than just burying a husband and wife. They were preserving a cosmic partnership for all eternity. They were ensuring that this essential balance would continue in the underworld and beyond. Their proximity in death was the ultimate reflection of their intertwined roles in life, a queen who ruled not behind her king, but beside him, sharing not just a palace, but a divine destiny. In their silent, adjacent tombs, they continue to speak. Two souls, wrapped in scarlet and stone, forever joined in one of history's most sacred and profound silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures. She is not a dusty relic in a museum case, but one of the most enigmatic and compelling figures of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 13 centuries, has now been opened, and it whispers a story across time, a story that asks more questions than it answers. And with every new discovery, those questions only grow louder. We may never know with absolute certainty who she was. No glyph carved her name into stone, no stela broadcast her deeds. And yet, the profound care of her burial, the spiritual wealth of her offerings, and the potent symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones all speak of a woman of immense importance. She was not merely a consort. She was a woman who held real power, spiritual authority, and the royal blood of a dynasty. Today, the Red Queen forces us to look again, to re-evaluate our old assumptions. She is a powerful, physical reminder that in the complex world of the classic Maya, women were not silent figures in the background. They were priestesses who communed with the gods. They were mothers who secured royal lineages. They were diplomats who forged alliances, and they were queens who governed cities. While larger-than-life kings like Pekel have long dominated the historical spotlight, the Red Queen's quiet re-emergence reminds us that power was not a male monopoly. It flowed through families, through rituals, and through the formidable women who stood at the center of it all. Her legacy, then, is more than the jade and obsidian she left behind. It's the vibrant, ongoing conversation she has started among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in her tomb was deliberate. It all sends one clear message across the centuries: this woman mattered. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know for certain, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history is not just a collection of settled facts. It is a living puzzle, an act of imagination, a shared human longing to connect with the ghosts of the past. In that sense, her legacy is still being written, every time we tell her story. She lies there still, in our mind's eye, wrapped in the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a mask of green jade, now stares back at us through the lens of science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but she is not voiceless. She is mysterious, but she is not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death, she rules something far greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And yet, somehow, she speaks. It's a story about a woman who was born in a blue house and went on to paint the world in every color of pain, passion, and defiance. It's a story about a body broken and a spirit that refused to shatter. This is the story of Frida Kahlo, but it's also a story about how we turn our deepest wounds into our greatest strengths. Our story begins on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant, sun-drenched district of Coyoacán, which was then a rustic village on the dusty outskirts of the sprawling, chaotic heart of Mexico City. It begins in a house that would become as famous as the woman who lived in it, La Casa Azul, the Blue House. Its walls, painted a shocking, brilliant cobalt, were a declaration against the muted tones of conformity. This house was not just a home, it was a universe in miniature, filled with color, contradiction, and a quiet, formidable strength. In time, it would become a sanctuary, a prison, a battleground, and finally, a museum dedicated to one of the most iconic and unrepeatable artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born into a family that was itself a study in contrasts. Her father, Guillermo Kahlo, was a German immigrant of Hungarian descent, a reserved and intellectual photographer who saw the world through the precise, methodical lens of his camera. He was a man of quiet passions, philosophy, literature, and the capturing of light on a glass plate. Her mother, Matilda Calderón y González, was his polar opposite. A devout Catholic woman of indigenous and Spanish heritage, she was deeply rooted in Mexican tradition, her life governed by faith, ritual, and a certain emotional distance that her daughters often struggled to breach. From this collision of worlds, the European intellectual and the Mexican traditionalist, Frida emerged. She would inherit her father's sharp, introspective gaze and his artistic eye, the ability to frame a subject and find its hidden truth. But she would also inherit her mother's fierce, unyielding resilience, a stubborn strength that was as native to the land as the volcanic rock beneath their feet. As a child, Frida was a firecracker. She was imaginative, outspoken, and possessed a boldness that often rattled the adults around her. She didn't just play, she invented worlds. She didn't just learn, she questioned everything. But at the tender age of 6, the first of life's cruel accidents found her. She contracted polio. The disease ravaged her body, leaving her right leg permanently thinner and weaker than her left. It was a physical difference she would try to mask for the rest of her life with long, flowing Tijuana skirts, but it was a vulnerability she never allowed to define or limit her spirit. The illness forced her into isolation. Bedridden for 9 long months, she was cut off from the world of other children, left alone with her thoughts and her imagination. It was during this period of forced stillness that she forged an unbreakable bond with her father. Guillermo, seeing the fire in his daughter, refused to let it be extinguished by her physical limitations. He encouraged her to fight back. He taught her to box. He pushed her to swim, to ride bicycles, to play soccer, all unconventional activities for a girl in early 20th century Mexico. He was nurturing not her fragility, but her strength, sharpening her mind as he helped her strengthen her body. Unlike most girls of her time and place, Frida had no interest in the prescribed path of marriage and domesticity. Her ambition was fierce and focused, she was going to become a doctor. In 1922, at the age of 15, she took a major step toward that dream, enrolling in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City. It was the best school in the country, a hub of post-revolutionary intellectual fervor, and she was one of only 35 girls accepted into a student body of 2,000. There, she was not just a student, she was a phenomenon. She stood out for her searing intelligence, her rebellious wit, and a unique, androgynous sense of style that defied every convention. She clipped her hair short and wore suits, challenging gender norms with a playful defiance. She quickly fell in with a group of like-minded young intellectuals who called themselves the cachuchas, named for the distinctive caps they wore. They were a band of brilliant misfits who debated philosophy, devoured literature, and plotted political mischief. They were in love with ideas, with revolution, with anything that challenged the old, staid traditions of their parents' generation. Frida was in her element. But even in those exhilarating early years, before the screech of metal and shattered glass would redefine her body, and before international fame would redefine her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world. She did it with sharp edges, with unapologetic ideas, and with an identity so vast and fiery it could never be contained by anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán. She was preparing, unknowingly, to remake herself, and the world of art, entirely. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two. There was the girl she had been before that afternoon, and there was the woman she was violently forced to become. She was 18 years old, and the world was brimming with possibility. After school, she and her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, boarded a rickety, brightly painted wooden bus. They were laughing, teasing each other, probably arguing about politics or poetry. Frida, even in matters of the heart, never did anything halfway. The air was filled with the mundane sounds of the city, the rumble of traffic, the chatter of passengers. And then, in an instant that stretched into a horrific eternity, the bus collided with an electric streetcar. The world dissolved into a cacophony of splintering wood, twisting metal, and human screams. The streetcar, a monstrous and indifferent force, crushed the fragile bus against a wall, flinging passengers like broken dolls. Frida's injuries were catastrophic, a litany of impossibly cruel wounds. An iron handrail, sheared from the bus's frame, became a spear. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis, shattering the bone. Her spinal column was fractured in 3 places. Her right leg, the one already weakened by polio, was broken in 11 places. Her foot was dislocated and crushed. Her collarbone snapped. 2 of her ribs were broken. Her shoulder was dislocated. The violence was so extreme that her clothes were torn from her body. In the dazed, surreal aftermath, as survivors stumbled from the wreckage, a man covered her bleeding, broken form with a borrowed overcoat. Another person noticed something bizarre, something that belonged more in a strange dream than in the bloody reality of a traffic accident. Frida's body was sparkling. A packet of powdered gold she had been carrying, perhaps for a craft project or an art class, had exploded on impact, dusting her mangled, naked body in what looked like glittering, sacred ash. She lay there, a broken sacrifice on a city street, anointed in gold. She was rushed to the Red Cross Hospital, a place of frantic, under-resourced desperation. Over the following months, she would endure a series of agonizing surgeries. She spent weeks on end trapped in a full-body plaster cast, a living mummy, flat on her back, unable to move, tormented by infections, excruciating pain, and the terrifying uncertainty of her future. The vibrant, ambitious girl who had dreamed of becoming a doctor, of mending other people's bodies, now found her own body to be a geography of ruins. That dream slipped further away with every torturous, immobile day. But in that profound, enforced stillness, something else began to stir. To combat the crushing boredom and despair, her father, Guillermo, brought her a set of his oil paints and brushes. Her mother, ever practical, commissioned a special easel that could be rigged to hang above her 4-poster bed. Then, they attached a large mirror to the underside of the bed's canopy, so that Frida could see the only subject available to her, herself. And so, lying in a prison of plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. At first, it was a distraction, a way to pass the endless hours. Then, it became an obsession. Her first paintings were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because her own reflection was her entire world. It was the only landscape she could explore. But what emerged from those early, tentative brushstrokes wasn't an act of vanity. It was a raw, desperate act of survival. The crash had broken her body, but in doing so, it had blasted open a door. It was a door into the intricate, terrifying, and beautiful landscape of her own mind, her own body, and eventually, into the surreal and deeply personal language of pain and identity that would define her art for the rest of her life. The girl who had wanted to heal others now began the lifelong, agonizing process of healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a living relic of an accident that refused to end, she began to forge a new language. What started as a form of therapy, a way to quiet the screaming in her own mind, soon blossomed into a fully formed artistic vocabulary. And that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often incredibly difficult to look at, which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite, picturesque landscapes. She painted her reality, and her reality was pain. It was physical pain, from a body that felt like a collection of broken parts held together by sheer will. It was emotional pain, from love and loss and betrayal. And it was existential pain, the pain of a brilliant mind trapped within a failing vessel. Her first and most enduring subjects were her own face and body. This was not born of narcissism. As she famously explained, "I paint myself because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best." In the lonely continent of her bed, her own reflection became her most intimate companion, her fiercest adversary, and her most patient model. Her early works were often small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels. This was a deliberate choice, inspired by the Mexican tradition of retablos. These are small, devotional folk paintings, usually created on metal, that tell the story of a miraculous recovery from sickness or an accident. A person would commission a retablo to thank a specific saint for their divine intervention. Frida took this sacred tradition and turned it inward. Her body became the canvas. Her suffering became the miracle. Her art became the prayer. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding, transforming her personal agony into a kind of secular martyrdom. In one painting, her skin is peppered with nails, like a modern-day Saint Sebastian. In another, she depicts herself floating in a barren, cracked desert landscape, a broken ionic column representing her shattered spine, her torso held together by a torturous-looking medical corset. She painted herself weeping, fractured, even decapitated, her head resting on a pillow, detached from her body. But in every single one of these portraits, her gaze is direct, unwavering, and utterly alive. Her eyes are not the eyes of a victim. They are the eyes of a witness. Her pain was never sanitized or made beautiful for the viewer's comfort. She painted the ugliness of trauma with a strange and compelling beauty, with defiance, and even with a dark, sardonic humor. Each piece was a reclamation. She was taking back her body from the doctors who prodded it, from the accident that broke it, and from a world that wanted to define her by her fragility. But Frida wasn't just telling her own story. She was inventing an entirely new kind of visual narrative. She blended the vivid colors and flat perspective of Mexican folk art with the dreamlike logic of surrealism, the clinical precision of medical illustrations, and a dense, personal symbolism drawn from Aztec mythology and Catholic iconography. Her paintings became surreal autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she had recovered enough to walk again, always painfully, always with the aid of corsets and a cane, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. The accident had killed that girl. In her place stood an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. She had taken the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person and had miraculously, alchemically, turned it into a wellspring of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain. She commanded the world to look at it, and in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred, revolutionary act of self-expression. In 1928, still navigating the world in a body that felt like a foreign country, still painting with a ferocious intensity, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the second, and arguably more destructive, accident of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior and already a living legend, Mexico's most famous and revered painter. Diego Rivera was a giant in every sense of the word. He was massive in physical stature, a human mountain with a booming voice and an insatiable appetite for food, women, and political debate. And he was a giant of Mexican muralism, the creator of sweeping, politically charged frescoes that covered the walls of public buildings, telling the grand, epic story of the Mexican people, their struggles, and their revolution. Frida, a member of the Communist Party, had admired his work from afar. But now, armed with a small portfolio of her raw, deeply personal paintings, she wanted his professional opinion. She tracked him down at the Ministry of Education, where he was perched high on a scaffold, bringing a new mural to life. She stood at the bottom and shouted up at him, her voice ringing with the blunt, fearless honesty that would define her. She didn't ask for favors. She demanded a verdict. "Look at my paintings," she said. "If they interest you, say so. If not, then likewise. I need to work to live." Diego, intrigued by this fiery young woman, climbed down. He looked at her canvases, small, intense, and utterly unlike his own grand, public art. He saw her pain, her rage, her irony, her beauty. He recognized something incredibly rare, an unfiltered artistic voice, raw and unpretentious. He later recalled, "It was obvious to me that this girl was an authentic artist." A tumultuous relationship ignited, one that was as all-consuming as it was creative. It was a collision of two immense, gravitational forces. Frida herself famously said, "I suffered two grave accidents in my life. One in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other accident is Diego." They married in 1929. To outsiders, they were a baffling pair. Diego, the massive, unfaithful, world-famous muralist, and Frida, the sharp-tongued, fiercely independent young artist, already walking with a cane, her body a testament to fragility and strength. Her own parents, disapproving of the match, called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was a whirlwind of passion, intellectual synergy, and profound chaos. Diego championed her art. He was her biggest supporter, encouraging her to embrace her unique style and never to compromise. But he was also endlessly, compulsively unfaithful. The deepest cut came when he had an affair with Frida's own younger sister, Cristina. The betrayal devastated Frida, shattering her in a way the bus crash never could. In return, and as an assertion of her own autonomy, she took lovers of her own, both men and women. Her rumored affairs are legendary, including one with the exiled Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky and another with the celebrated American painter Georgia O'Keeffe. Their relationship was a constant cycle of love, betrayal, screaming matches, and passionate reconciliations. They divorced in 1939, unable to bear the pain, only to find they couldn't bear to be apart. They remarried just a year later, but on Frida's terms. This time, she insisted on financial independence and the right to live in her own house, La Casa Azul, separately from him when she chose. Their second marriage was less a traditional romance and more a radical pact of creative partnership and mutual, if painful, understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant, monumental force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, and he infuriated her. But he also saw her, truly saw her, and believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who was rewriting the rules of what a painting could be. Together, they were never peaceful. But they were legendary. In the early 1930s, Frida Kahlo packed her Tijuana dresses and followed the elephant, Diego Rivera, on a journey north into the belly of the beast, the United States. Diego had been commissioned to paint high-profile murals in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York, and Frida went with him, stepping into a world that was both fascinating and deeply alienating. These years abroad brought her face to face with the roaring engine of American industrialism, with staggering wealth, and with the profound contradictions of capitalism. The experience would leave her with a deep and lasting political discomfort. Frida was, to her core, a proud Mexican nationalist and a committed communist. She revered her country's indigenous traditions and believed passionately in the ideals of the revolution. The empty opulence she witnessed among the American elite, the Gatsbys, Fords, and Rockefellers, struck her as shallow and soulless, especially as the Great Depression was simultaneously ravaging much of the country. In letters home, she wrote scathing, witty critiques of Gringolandia, mocking the culture's obsession with appearances and its vapid materialism. She missed the grit, the color, the vibrant chaos, and the raw authenticity of Mexico. While Diego was up on his scaffolds, painting enormous public murals celebrating the power of the American worker on factory walls, Frida retreated inward. She began to paint her own, quieter revolutions. Her works from this period were deeply personal, small in scale, often painted on tin or canvas. Her signature style solidified, sharp, surreal, emotionally raw, and intensely intimate. It was during this time in the US that she produced some of her most iconic and heart-wrenching self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself as a record of her appearance, she painted herself to survive. Her body, always a source of chronic pain, became her primary landscape. The emotional turmoil of her marriage, combined with a devastating miscarriage she suffered in Detroit, turned her gaze further inward. Her portraits from this period are unflinching. They show her bleeding, fragmented, and exposed, yet her face is almost always calm, her gaze direct and unapologetic. One of her most powerful and difficult works, Henry Ford Hospital, 1932, is a testament to this period. In it, she paints herself lying naked on a hospital bed, a single tear on her cheek, her body hemorrhaging onto the white sheets. From her stomach, 6 red, vein-like ribbons connect her to a series of floating symbols of her loss and pain, a male fetus, her lost son, Dieguito, a snail, symbolizing the slow, agonizing pace of the miscarriage, a purple orchid, a flower Diego had brought her, medical equipment, and a fractured pelvis, the original source of her inability to carry a child. It was a canvas that bled with a truth so raw and graphic it was revolutionary. When they returned to Mexico, Frida immersed herself completely in the world she had so deeply missed. She and Diego welcomed the exiled Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky and his wife into their home, La Casa Azul, offering them political asylum. Frida's identity as a Mexicana became her armor and her art. She began to wear traditional Tehuana dresses almost exclusively, not as a costume, but as a powerful political and cultural statement, a celebration of Mexico's indigenous matriarchal cultures. Her art was never separate from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology were all inextricably intertwined on the canvas. While Diego Rivera was painting grand murals of revolution in the abstract, Frida Kahlo was painting its human cost and its personal stakes, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self, always, staring back. In exile and in illness, she had become not just a painter of pain, but a painter of profound and personal resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico for good in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's strange and interesting wife. She had become something else entirely, a force in her own right, an artist whose work radiated with a raw honesty, a surreal symbolism, and a fierce cultural identity that was all her own. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully and unapologetically into herself. Her sanctuary, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán, became a living, breathing extension of her imagination. She transformed it into a universe of her own making. The cobalt blue walls, the bright yellow trim, the lush garden filled with pre-Columbian Aztec statues, it was a declaration of her aesthetic. She filled the space with life, spider monkeys and parrots wandered freely through the rooms, and hairless Xoloitzcuintli dogs, an ancient Aztec breed, slept in the sun-drenched courtyard. The house was a vibrant blend of tradition and rebellion, of folkloric elegance and earthy realness. Here, she surrounded herself with the things that nourished her soul, pre-Columbian artifacts, a vast collection of retablos and folk art, and shelves overflowing with revolutionary books on politics and philosophy. She made her own body a canvas. She wore bold, embroidered Tehuana dresses, wove bright ribbons and fresh flowers into her iconic braided hair, and adorned herself with heavy silver and jade jewelry. She painted amidst the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi music drifting in from the street. This period marked a spectacular explosion of her creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more politically charged. It was during this time that she painted one of her most famous masterpieces, The Two Fridas, 1939. In this large double self-portrait, she reveals a divided self. On one side sits the Frida that Diego loved, dressed in traditional indigenous clothing, her heart whole and holding a small portrait of him. On the other side sits the Frida he abandoned, dressed in a formal Victorian European gown, her heart torn open and bleeding, attempting to clamp the artery with surgical forceps. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a breathtaking portrait of love, loss, heartbreak, and the dualities of her heritage. In 1939, her work finally gained international recognition. She was invited to exhibit her paintings in Paris, where she was celebrated by the intellectual and artistic elite. Artists like Pablo Picasso, Vasily Kandinsky, and Marcel Duchamp praised her fiercely original style. The leader of the Surrealist movement, André Breton, was particularly captivated, eager to claim her as one of his own. But even among the masters of the bizarre and the subconscious, Frida stood apart. She famously pushed back against the label, clarifying with her typical bluntness, "They thought I was a surrealist, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romantic, postcard version for tourists, but the living, breathing, bleeding, beautiful country she adored. Her work pulsed with a rich vocabulary of symbols, skeletons and skulls representing the Mexican embrace of death, hummingbirds for luck and love, thorns for pain, monkeys as tender protectors, corn as the seed of life, and blood as the price of it all. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of its colonial past and its tumultuous present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger and more confident, her physical body continued its slow, inexorable decline. Multiple spinal surgeries, chronic infections, and constant, grinding pain became her daily reality. Still, she painted through it all, propped up in bed, her torso bound in plaster or steel corsets, her fingers clenched tightly around a brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power, through paint, through politics, and through her fearless, magnificent embrace of the self. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued its relentless betrayal. Her spine, broken decades earlier, was now deteriorating. Her right leg was plagued by gangrene and constant infections. She would ultimately undergo more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling, back-to-back succession. At times, she was bedridden for months on end, encased in restrictive body casts that felt like coffins, or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart in a medieval-looking torture of her own consent. But still, she painted. In fact, the more her body failed her, the more ferocious her art became. Each canvas produced during these agonizing years was both a release and a radical act of resistance. Her work grew darker, more visceral, and more defiant. She painted with a chilling clarity sharpened by constant pain, refusing to hide her suffering behind gentle metaphors. In her masterpiece, The Broken Column, 1944, she presents herself to the viewer nearly naked, split down the middle. Her flesh is held together by a white medical corset, and where her spine should be, there is a crumbling, cracked ionic column on the verge of collapse. Her skin is pierced with dozens of nails, the largest one driven deep into her heart. It is a portrait of complete and utter ruin. Yet, her face is stoic. Tears stream from her eyes, but her gaze is direct, unflinching, almost challenging. Pain, for Frida, was no longer just a subject. It had become her constant companion, her daily antagonist, her dark and twisted muse. Her political voice also grew louder and more urgent. She officially rejoined the Mexican Communist Party and, when she could, marched in demonstrations. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, her frail body a stark contrast to her fiery spirit, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans against imperialism and injustice. In 1953, in a long-overdue celebration of her genius, Frida was given her first major solo exhibition in her home country of Mexico. Her health, however, was so fragile that her doctors forbade her from attending. She was bedridden and told not to move. So, Frida did what only Frida would do. She had her grand, four-poster bed loaded onto the back of a truck and, arriving by ambulance, had herself carried in on a stretcher and placed in the very center of the gallery. There, dressed in her finest Tijuana finery, adorned with jewelry and flowers, she held court from her bed, greeting hundreds of friends, artists, and admirers with tequila, laughter, and that indomitable fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings are both haunting and beautiful, childlike and harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, but casting away her crutches, held tenderly by the giant, godlike hands of Karl Marx. It's a work of desperate, utopian faith. Her very last known work, completed just days before her death, was a simple still life of freshly sliced watermelons, their red flesh vibrant and alive. On one of the slices, she painted the words, "Viva la vida, long live life." Even as she stood at the precipice of death, her final message was one of defiance, joy, and vitality. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just paintings. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain but always, always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died. It happened in the same place she had been born, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official cause of death was listed as a pulmonary embolism. But those closest to her whispered of something deeper, something that couldn't be written on a death certificate. She had been ill, yes, but she was also utterly exhausted, exhausted by the decades of relentless pain, by the endless cycle of surgeries, by the long, brutal war she had waged with her own body. Some have long speculated that she took her own life, choosing her own exit after her right leg was amputated at the knee the previous year. Just days before her death, she had defied her doctor's orders one last time to attend a political protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. Weak and confined to a wheelchair, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final, defiant heartbeat. Her last diary entry, written just before the end, was brief but piercing: "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was a national event, held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body lay in state, her coffin draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, a final, provocative political act. A procession of friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries came to pay their respects. Diego Rivera, the great elephant, was inconsolable, openly weeping. He would later call her death the most tragic day of his life, recognizing her as the greatest love he had ever known, even as his betrayals had so nearly broken her. And then, in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was known mostly in esoteric art circles. Her work was difficult to categorize, too political and personal for the formalists, too surreal for the realists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her unyielding spirit began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists began the crucial work of reclaiming the forgotten voices of powerful women, Frida's became a roar. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She became a symbol. She was a symbol of pain transformed into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, of disability, of revolution, and of fearless, radical authenticity. Her face, the unibrow, the direct gaze, the flowers in her hair, became iconic. Her blue house became a sacred museum. Her diary became a treasured text. And her paintings, once seen as mere curiosities, now hang in the world's greatest museums, speaking to millions. Frida Kahlo had spent much of her life in the monumental shadow of Diego Rivera. But in death, she stepped into a light all her own. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror, and she dared every one of us to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere. It is printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and Halloween costumes. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct, unblinking gaze, they are all instantly recognizable across the globe. But what makes her legacy so potent isn't just that people know her face. It's that they recognize the profound truth behind it. Frida never tried to be flawless. She never tried to be pretty or polite or easy to digest. She didn't fit into the neat boxes society builds for women, for artists, for the disabled. And she didn't care to. In a world that relentlessly demands perfection, she gave us something far more valuable. She gave us her realness. It was a realness that was raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, and full of contradiction. She took everything the world saw as a flaw or a weakness, her disability, her bisexuality, her communist politics, her unfeminine features, and she turned it all into a source of power, into art that transcends borders and decades. She has become more than an artist, she is a global symbol of defiance. For queer communities, she is a fearless icon who loved openly and unapologetically in a time of suffocating silence. For women, she is a reminder that power does not require permission. For disabled artists and individuals, she is irrefutable proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she is a beloved daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever a part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too painfully personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column aren't just seen, they are felt, deeply and viscerally, by anyone who has ever suffered and has needed to find a way to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins of society and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who adorned herself in finery, a woman betrayed who never stopped loving, a body in pieces animated by a soul that was unbreakable. And through it all, she painted not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself, with a courage that still takes one's breath away. And in doing so, she told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now, when we see her face, we see courage. We see color. We see resistance. We see life. We see Frida, not gone, but immortal.